Getting a COVID-19 vaccine has consumed governments around the world. Here in Canada, the federal government has announced 2 new agreements to secure access to potential vaccines. Johnson & Johnson has agreed to deliver up to 38 million doses of its vaccine candidate, and Novavax has agreed to deliver 76 million doses to Canada should the vaccine prove effective and meet regulatory requirements. Novavax says their vaccine could be available to Canadians as early as the second quarter of next year. In total, Canada now has 4 agreements in place for potential vaccines. So why is the federal government betting on these candidates? And what happens if all 4 fail? Patty Hajdu is the Federal Minister of Health. She joins me now from Thunder Bay, Ontario. Welcome back to the program, Minister.
Thank you so much.
Now, we heard there are 4. The World Health Organization says there are more than 166 vaccine candidates at various stages of preclinical and clinical testing. That's around the globe. How confident are you that you're betting on the right 4 horses right now?
Well, thankfully, Catherine, it doesn't have to be me that makes these bets. We have the Vaccine Task Force, which is comprised of researchers and scientists that are heavily immersed in the area of vaccine expertise and immunology, who are guiding Canada's bets, as you call them. I think that's a very critical component to our choosing successful candidates. But as you said, it is a highly sort of rapidly moving space with so much research happening so quickly, so many candidates. So we're very lucky to have this Canadian expertise guiding us in terms of where to place our money and where to place our efforts in terms of procuring vaccines.
Now, these 4 candidates are in a pretty critical phase of things. I wonder what those experts are telling you about how likely it is that any of the 4 will make it past this phase.
Well, again, we wouldn't have put our money on these particular vaccines if we didn't have them as recommended vaccines by the Vaccine Task Force. So obviously, the Vaccine Task Force feels these are promising candidates. But having said that, there is no guarantee, as you put it, in terms of any candidate. And of course, I have confidence and optimism that science is doing its important work to find a vaccine for COVID-19. But we also know that immunology and vaccine development is extremely challenging, a very complex space, as they say, as the scientists will tell you themselves. So we're lucky again to have this level of expertise in our own country to help guide the government.
The last time I was hosting this show, I spoke to Minister Anand about this issue, and she seemed to hint that, for instance, the Oxford vaccine, which has proven to be quite promising, that there were conversations going on around that. I wonder, are you getting advice about an optimal number? If we continue this sort of like horse racing metaphor here, you're hedging your bets. Is there a best number of vaccines for Canada to have access to be in an optimal situation?
I'm not sure that we're shooting for a specific number to have placed our bets on, if you will, but really to make sure that where we're putting our money and our investment and our energy, are on the most promising candidates. Listen, we're determined that Canada will have a vaccine, and we may have multiple different kinds of vaccines, and that won't be a bad thing. That will be a good thing. So I think the guidance again of the task force, the work that Minister Anand is doing, and Minister Bains, we do also have some Canadian vaccine candidates that maybe aren't as far as long, but certainly promising as well. I think it's really, really important that we have a number of options available to Canada, because that does place us in a better position for eventual success.
Do you talk about scenarios where none of these vaccine candidates ends up being viable?
I'm an optimist, but I'm also a realist and a pragmatic person. So I think my strategy my entire life has been planned for the worst case scenario. And because vaccine development is so challenging and so tricky, despite the fact that experts around the world believe there will be a vaccine available, there could be a scenario where the world is living without one. And what does that look like? That's why it's important that we continue to invest in therapeutics as well. We know COVID-19 is here to stay, likely globally for quite a while. Elimination, when we are talking about millions and millions of cases worldwide, is likely not in our near future. And so that's part of the work that I've been doing with the department, is the work to figure out how we live with this virus, how we ensure that we're developing better therapeutics and better understanding from a science perspective of how to protect vulnerable people in the country from really adverse outcomes with COVID-19, including death, while continuing to sort of strengthen our research and and development approaches domestically and working with international partners to find longer-term solutions like a vaccine.
When it comes to the vaccines that are being developed in Canada or the Canadian officials are looking at, I wonder in terms of the Health Canada approval process, how do you ensure that that happens quickly, effectively, but obviously safely and free of political pressure too?
It used to take upwards of 4 years to develop a vaccine from sort of concept to approval by Health Canada, but we've managed to accelerate a lot of the regulatory processes so they can be happening simultaneously. So you can have a vaccine in a number of different clinical trials stages, as well as having, companies being able to submit on an ongoing basis to Health Canada information and evidence that can help us more expeditiously review that vaccine and provide an approval for use much more quickly. So this is the work that we've been doing to prepare for, obviously, the development of a vaccine, really almost since COVID arrived on the scene. And I have to thank Health Canada and the regulatory body that is working so hard, not just on vaccines, by the way, but all of the other products and therapeutics that are coming into Health Canada to be approved. They are working full steam ahead and doing amazing work for all of us here in Canada.
Okay, I want to talk about, a positive outcome, which is where indeed there is a successful vaccine candidate, but some of the ethical challenge that comes along with that. Last month on this show, Dr. David Naylor said that making a COVID-19 vaccine available to all Canadians, quote, may be one of the biggest national projects this country has taken on in its history. He says it's not just about logistics, but it's about political and ethical issues too. Where is the conversation in terms of sorting those ethical issues out about, for instance, who gets access first?
Well, absolutely. First of all, it'll be really important that the country acts in a unified way. And that's why things like the federal-provincial partnership that we have, that I meet with my counterparts every week to talk through various aspects of COVID-19, that's so important. But also Dr. Tam through the Special Advisory Committee and all of the other medical officers of health, that coordination is going to be critical. We also have a committee that looks at access to vaccines nationally, and they are going to help us, again, a variety of experts, also experts with ethical backgrounds, to determine who those priority populations are that need to receive that vaccine first. You're absolutely right. These are challenging conversations and challenging decisions, but we're going to want to make sure that we're doing this in a fair way, in a safe way, and in an ethical way all across the country.
Does that mean, for instance, are you prepared to put prisoners near the front of that line, given the kind of jeopardy that they're at, but perhaps ahead of the general population?
Well, listen, absolutely vulnerable people could be considered to be priority population. It could also be people that are working closely with patients of COVID. So, for example, frontline healthcare workers. And those are the deliberations the committee is having right now to determine how to do that prioritization. Because, of course, you can imagine there are a number of groups that would consider themselves priority populations. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be very important that we understand how to do that in as quick, expeditious, but also fair process.
So are you saying no politics involved, politicians, I suppose, involved at all? It's all experts?
That's the ideal state, actually. Okay. If you think about medicine and ethics, I think the ideal state is that it is as apolitical as possible. I see my role as Minister of Health as a facilitator, and I've said this often to Health Canada and the Public Health Agency of Canada. Tell me the tools that you need. Mm-hmm. Tell me what you need to unlock from the federal government. Oftentimes, that might be money, that might be accelerated capacity for regulations, et cetera. And I will go about and try to make that happen. But from my perspective, it's very important that we rely on our incredible medical professionals and other professionals that are going to help us make these really challenging decisions.
I wonder, though, in terms of actually getting people, the other side of the coin is getting people to take the vaccine if indeed they are that becomes a possibility. There was a survey out by the Angus Reid Institute that found 32% of Canadians said they would eventually get a vaccine, but they'd want to wait a while. I just wonder, do you think you've done enough work to get Canadians on board with the idea of taking this vaccine? I know you reiterated today or said today that it wasn't going to be mandatory, but is there not a significant amount of public health education that really still needs to happen at this point?
Absolutely, and that public health education around the benefits of vaccines is ongoing, as you know. And every year, this country works very hard to increase the number of Canadians that will take their flu shot, for example. So we'll be building on some of the knowledge and research that we have around vaccine hesitancy, as it's called, and how we get more Canadians to, first of all, vaccinate themselves against a known entity, the flu, this fall, so that we can reduce the risk of contracting the flu and reduce the burden on our healthcare system, and build on that to increase awareness, education, and comfort level with the eventual COVID-19 vaccine. This is not going to happen overnight, of course, because it is a new illness and it's a new vaccine. But I think part of it is transparent, ongoing conversations with Canadians and letting them know every step of the way in a very transparent way what we're doing to procure these vaccines and how the research looks to ensure their safety.
On the topic of COVID, but not so much vaccines, I want to talk about the return to school that's happening right now in Quebec today. It's the English school boards. Your children are adults. If they were younger, would you be sending an elementary school child back to class right now if it was a class of, let's say, 30 children?
Well, listen, I live in Thunder Bay, Ontario, where we have one active case of COVID-19. So, based on the epidemiology of my area, the next thing I would do is talk to the school board and the school officials to determine what practices they had in place to protect the children and the people that work within that school board. I think it's really important for parents to comfort themselves by having those conversations with school administrators, even to the point of going and visiting the schools themselves to understand physical distancing, spacing. Those are all very reasonable questions. And I know school boards are working really hard across the country to make sure that parents have that access and that comfort level. Finally, I'll just say that there is national guidance for school boards and for provinces and territories on school-aged children. And as a parent, I would highly recommend other parents download that document on canada.ca/coronavirus. Take a look at that document and compare it to the plans of your particular school board or school setting to determine if there are gaps. And I think, listen, this is going to be an anxious time for everyone, but education for young people is equally important. And so everything we can do, including the $2 billion to support provinces and territories for a safe restart of school, is critically important.
I do have to ask you before I let you go, Minister, about the question of opioids and overdose deaths that we're seeing in this country. You know as well, if not better than I do, for instance, that the numbers out of BC have been particularly alarming, worse than the number of COVID deaths that they're seeing. A couple of weeks ago, the Public Prosecution Service of Canada issued a new directive permitting prosecution only in the most serious cases of drug possession, those that put public safety and especially children at risk. Is this a step towards decriminalization of simple possession of drugs across this country?
Well, I think the Public Prosecution Service decision reflects the fact that increasingly societies and communities are recognizing that problematic substance use is one of a health issue, not a criminal issue. And certainly much of my pre-politics life was spent in the area of substance use issues, including working with street-engaged people when I ran a homeless shelter here in Thunder Bay. And I can tell you that no one tool is going to be the silver bullet to helping people with problematic substance use, but what communities need is a variety of tools that they can use to ensure people, first of all, can prevent problematic substance use, have access to appropriate treatments, reduce illness through harm reduction mechanisms like safer supply and safer consumption sites, and finally have enforcement approaches that are practical and based on the realities of people who use substances.
It sounds to me like you're talking about decriminalization as part of a solution and yet not actually advocating for decriminalization. I'm not quite sure I understand where you've left the discussion.
I think what I'm saying is that there isn't a silver bullet. And I think that what the Public Prosecution Service said is essentially, look, this is an issue. This is a health issue. And for people who are possessing substances solely for their own personal use, these kinds of folks should be supported in their communities to access the kinds of services that will reduce their risk in terms of potentially overdose or other adverse outcomes, and to access the supports and services they need to lead healthier, happier lives. And I think that reflection is a very important one. I'll just say that the work that our government has been doing in that regard is also critically important. Safer supply programs in BC, in Toronto now, making sure that communities have access
But do you think that decriminalization is warranted of simple possession of all drugs?
I respect the decision of the Public Prosecution Service. Listen, and as a person who's worked on drug policy, I'll just reiterate: there isn't a silver bullet. There isn't one approach that's going to be a world of change for people who use substances. It is a comprehensive approach that's needed, and that's what our government's working on.
Okay, well, I mean, public health advocates have a lot to say about this aspect of that approach, but we have eaten up all the time we have with you today, so thank you very much for the discussion. Minister of Health, Patty Hajdu, speaking to us from Thunder Bay, Ontario.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.